So I found a way, I think you'll be impressed, to incorporate my special interest of STEM into a PBS framework in terms of membership, belonging, and soft skill development. This is a recent, I've been conducting some studies in the area of robotics, teaching students with autism and their peers to code and to use robotics. This is different than some of the other literature that uses robotics as the social mediator or uses a robot as to encourage conversation or joint attention. So this is actually the students having some autonomy and ownership over that. So the first study that we did was just to gather some descriptive data on barriers and facilitators to teaching coding of robotics to students with ASD and their typical peers. We wanted to examine, it was a what's happening type of a study, right? What happens when we put kids with autism and their peers in elementary school together in a robotics camp, and we have supports for the students with autism, but not too much supports, which I'll get to in a second. And they're engaged in this elective activity. So students volunteered to participate. It was a robotics camp, and they were really excited to participate in this. So we also wanted to explore this idea of collaboration. Really what I was getting at and didn't realize at the time was membership, belonging, and soft skills and shared learning experiences between the children with ASD and their peers. I've since conducted a number of experimental studies, but this was the first sort of iteration, and we had to kind of find out what was happening at that time. So my doctoral student, John Wright, he conducted this study. He was the primary interventionist for this study, and the setting took place in Texas at a inclusive school, but it was specifically geared for individuals with autism spectrum disorder in a very structured environment. There were BCBAs present and RBTs, a lot of, possibly too many support staff. And there was 4 to 5 students with autism in the first week, and 4 to 5 students with autism in the first 2 weeks. It was a 2-week program. In the first week, there were 4 to 5 peers, peer group 1, and in the second week, there was the second group of peers. So we saw some interesting things happen when the students with autism became the masters in the second week. The way we wanted to frame the lesson structure was a mini lesson with guided practice, independent practice, all those things that we know are best practice in terms of instructional methods in this field. But we also wanted to give sort of universal supports. So embedded in each of those instructional, each of those courses would be things like calibrated drawing lines, explore U-turn codes in the case of the robotics, but we also embedded social skills. So in this lesson, we taught how to ask for help, and we also taught how to recognize whether or not your peer needs help. And we taught that to the whole class. And so there wasn't anybody singled out. It wasn't, this student needs help or this student doesn't know how to ask for help. It was, if you see these signs, this could mean that a student needs help. And this is what you can do if you need help. We also had help cards. So we had some accommodations, but they were provided for everyone. And we had some instruction on social skills. But very little. We tried not to do too much of that because we really wanted to see what would happen if we didn't do that. So the lesson structure included guided practice with paraeducator support. You can see how many adults are in the room. This particular lesson was on calibration and preparing the robot for coding. So the calibration of the robot begins by, these are Ozobots, is the type of robot that we used in this study. And they use a marker and paper format. And so they're really easy to use for the most part. There were some motor issues that came about. In order to calibrate the robot, you have to draw a circle. That's how you calibrate it. And you place the robot on the circle until it turns green, and then you're able to draw lines, and it will move around on the lines. Then we had independent practice. And so the little girl is a typically developing peer, a neurotypical peer. And the individual with the green shirt is a child with autism. And she's kind of reaching over, showing him how to do the codes. This was one of the very first days. This was independent. We didn't do any peer instruction per se, peer mediated instruction. And so then the child with autism reaches over and does hand over hand with her, which I thought was really cute and spontaneous and like, let me show you how to do it. So peers organically supported students with ASD, and this was often unprompted. So in this example, the little boy with the red striped shirt is a student with autism. This is one of his paraprofessionals or his BCBA. And then the child to the other side of her with the green shirt is a typically developing peer. And what she's trying to show him is that if you put your hand in front of the robot, it will stop because it has sensors and it will stop moving. So she's trying to show him that. So he's looking, he's seeing what she's doing. He attempts to do it incorrectly. He has an incorrect attempt. And then the peer just jumps in. No peer-mediated instruction, no training, no explicit instruction, no, just this is what you should do if you see somebody that needs help, you can show by doing. And so he jumps in and shows him how to do it, and then the student with autism is able to demonstrate that skill. So some of our preliminary findings also included observational learning. Obviously, individuals with autism spectrum disorder do have a more challenging time, as illustrated today, with observational learning and orientation to the task. We saw less of that with this activity, possibly because of how motivating it was for students to get it right or to get this robot to do something, right? So the idea of high interest materials. So you can see him sort of sneaking a peek over at the child next to him. He's been able to calibrate his robot. He's got a circle drawn on his paper, and he's looking over and he's saying, okay, well, after you draw the circle, then what do you do? And so you're supposed to draw a line. And so he is kind of peeking over, saying, well, what am I supposed to do next? The cool thing about this was that we also saw it on both sides. So the little guy with the paper that's blue and red, he had just been taught to draw lines using a black marker. So he spontaneously drew a blue line. And when he placed the robot on the blue line, it turned blue. Then he spontaneously created a red line. And he placed the robot on the red line and it turned red. And so she, the typically developing peer, is looking over like, wait, what's going on here? How are you getting your robot to light up? Because that wasn't one of the ways that we had instructed them at that point in time. And so we saw some problem solving, some creativity, some of those soft skills embedded, naturally emerging within this really motivational activity. The other key finding that we found that we're going to apply to the rest of our research studies is this idea of shared space. And so in the beginning of the week, we had everyone had sort of their own markers. They had enough for their own. All the markers were in the middle of the table, but everyone had enough to have 4 markers for each student. They each had their own robot, and then they each had some pieces of paper that they could develop their codes or their lines on. When we just gave them a bigger piece of paper, like it can be this simple, they quite literally and figuratively began making connections with one another. And so you can see that there's this shared space. Nobody knows whose robots are whose. Nobody cares because they're all doing something really interesting. They've created their own tracks, is what we call these, and codes, but then they've connected them all together. And no one is making a judgment about whether or not it's a good code or a bad code or a good track or a bad track. We're just all kind of seeing what's happening, all of the students. And so the little guy, again, with the blue track, he creates this blue track. It's kind of messy. Nobody says to him, oh, no, that's not the way you're supposed to do it. They all just sit back and watch what happens when.